You've landed inside Launch Street, the Business Innovation Podcast, where we interview top innovators out there shaking things up so you can innovate, differentiate, and get further faster. Since you're here, we know you're the type of person that recognizes the importance of unlocking your innovation advantage so you can compete and win. And now, your host, the person that has worked with leading companies like Disney, Procter & Gamble, Aero Electronics, the U.S. Army Research Labs, and Red Robin on upping their innovation advantage, Tamara Gontor.
And here we are, everyday innovators on Launch Street, getting ready for some wisdom bombs. I love today's podcast because this is all about reclaiming your most valuable resources, time and energy. And who doesn't want more of both, right? I know I do. So before we dive into this lively interview, I have an announcement. As you've heard me say dozens of times, I have a book coming out called Innovation is Everybody's Business. It's how to ignite, scale, and sustain innovation for competitive edge, both on the individual level and at the team and organizational level. I am super excited about it. And let me just say thank you to all those who've already pre-ordered. I'm so honored that you have done that. Now, I may be a little biased, but there is a ton of value in this book. So here's the announcement. I have released our pre-order bonus packages. There are 3 of them. So whether you're an individual, medium team, or a large team, there's something for you. I'm pretty proud of these bonuses my team and I put together. They aren't just the random add-ons that you see. These are things of real value. So go to our website, go to launchstreet.com, click on the book link in the nav bar, and check it out. We'll put the link in the show notes too. And you'll have more than enough time to dig into the bonuses after listening to today's guest, Steve Glaveski. He is the author of the newly released book, Time Rich, Do Your Best Work, Live Your Best Life. He's also an entrepreneur, author, podcast host, whose mission is to unlock the latent potential of people so that they can create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. He's also the CEO of Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator based in Melbourne and Singapore that works with large organizations around the globe. So here's what I love about this interview. It is tangible advice. Things like how to prioritize with a cost-impact analysis, how to avoid what he calls insecurity work. I just love that phrase. Once you hear what he's talking about, you'll totally dig it too. And also things like how to overcome the confusion between time worked and output created. We go a little over on this one in terms of time because he's keeping the value bombs going the entire time. It's kind of ironic, right? We're talking about being time rich and we go over in time, but the value's there. Okay. Here we go. Steve, thank you so much for joining me all the way from the other side of the globe.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me tomorrow all the way from the other side of the globe.
I don't know if it actually is all the way on the other side, but you know what I mean.
It's somewhere. It's probably a good 10,000 miles away. So I think other side of the globe is a justified description.
Fair enough. So tell me, Steve, what's one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
One thing they'd be surprised to learn about me is that while I sport a skin fade hairstyle nowadays with the part on the side, growing up I had waist length hair and played in a thrash metal band. And that's probably one thing a lot of people don't know about me. And the first time I actually mention it to them, you just see their eyes pop out of their heads like, what? You played in a metal band? I'm like, yes, I did. And I actually still really enjoy the music, still head out to a lot of concerts nowadays, even though I don't quite look the part. So that's probably the one thing I'd say. I
mean, I'm really more stuck on the waist length hair, to be honest. Like, that's a lot of work.
It was a lot of work, although I did get quite the compliments from a lot of members of the opposite sex back in the day. I don't know if it was the shampoo I was using or what.
So it was a pickup tactic. I get it. Okay. That is kind of interesting. So I do find it's kind of interesting to me how we have these things in our past that were just kind of a point in time, and we might have, like appearance-wise, we move on from them, but they still are a part of our personality. I used to do a lot of hip-hop dancing and competitions on the street corner with, cardboard box, and people now look at me in my high heels and my makeup and they're like, wait, what?
Yeah, it's funny how that stuff sort of sticks with you, though. I think we have these sort of coming of age ceremonies when we're about 12 to 14 years old. We kind of find something that defines us. And for whatever reason, we kind of go back to that throughout life in some way.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a great way to say it. But I do think it stays a part of you. It just isn't
Yeah,
worn on the surface the way it might have been when you had waist length hair. It still blows my mind. But yeah.
exactly. Yeah. I think with like listening to that kind of music growing up, it's quite anti-authoritarian, it's very rebellious and all that sort of stuff. And I think those underlying character attributes come out in different ways. For example, entrepreneurship and deciding to say, to turn my back on the corporate world and do my own thing. I think if I didn't perhaps have that upbringing, and if wasn't comfortable with going against the grain, I may not have made that decision. But having had that background made taking the path less traveled a little bit more appealing, so to speak, in my later 20s.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's funny, I was just thinking, as you were saying that, I was reminded that my parents used to hate my music. And I think part
What
of
was
that
your
was
music? Just the
well,
hip
it was
hop?
all
Yep.
like, yeah, it was all rap, like hardcore
Yep.
NWA, Public Enemy. I grew up in the Bay Area in California.
Ice
So
tea.
yeah, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Nice.
totally. I mean, oh my gosh, yes. Wu-Tang Clan is like a little older, like, and my parents just hated it. But I think the reason they hated it was partially the dirty language, but partially the message was like, don't listen to anybody. And I think they were like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know about that tomorrow. Maybe follow some rules, maybe.
Yeah.
But you're right. It does
Yeah.
a little bit become a part of who you are. And I think people who know me would say that one of my defining characteristics is that I don't think that the rules apply to me. So I know they're there. It's fine, Steve, if you want to follow them, like, good for you, but I'm not going to. And so
Mhm.
I think you're right. I think it carries on. And I think that kind of leads actually to the question I want to ask you, and kind of the expertise that you bring, the insight to this podcast, to our conversation, which is around the modern workplace. So where we are now
Mhm.
with our thrasher and our hip hop backgrounds, um, what do you think is wrong with the way that the modern workplace is set up?
That's a very loaded question, Tamara, because there are numerous things. But I guess to answer this question, I need to go back to 1938, which is when the 8-hour workday was ratified. And this was based on almost half a century of lobbying by workers who were predominantly employed during the Industrial Revolution on assembly lines, in coal mines, doing all that sort of work, which is very, very algorithmic. And as we know, the world has changed a hell of a lot in the 82 years since. For many of us, the whole nature of work has moved from packing widgets into a box towards work that requires us to think, to solve complex problems, to work with other people. And when we're doing creative work, or heuristic work as it's technically known, conflating hours with output doesn't make sense. Conflating presence, being at your desk, with being productive, also doesn't make sense. But this is the way many organizations run today. It's about the 9 to 5 workday. It's about being at your desk. It's about counting hours. But beyond that, I mean, when we look at how people spend their time when they're at the office, it's a lot of outsourcing accountability. The larger an organization gets, the less trust there is amongst people. And so what do we do instead? We have very high delegations of authority, which means if I want to make a small decision, I need to get sign off by 1 or 2 other people. We have a hell of a lot of meetings, oftentimes with too many people at the table. Oftentimes these meetings go for too long. And so come the end of the day, we don't really have much to show for all of our quote unquote being busy. The average person is interrupted something like 50 to 60 times a day in the office, and most of these interruptions aren't important. And as we know, workplace stress is at a high, and people just aren't engaged at work. And I think, I wrote something the other day about the coronavirus, which everybody's talking about, but nowadays, well, now with the coronavirus, a lot of big tech companies and companies in general are sending people home. They're saying, hey, work from home. And I think this is perhaps a long overdue experiment. Going back before I got into entrepreneurship 12 years ago, I worked at Ernst & Young. We had VPN sign on. You could work remotely, but it wasn't actively encouraged. I think leaders still have this tendency to anchor to the past, the way things have always been done. But hopefully with more organizations now working from home, running this forced experiment, if it turns out to be a longer term experiment, depending on how everything goes with COVID-19, it might mean that we actually learn that, hey, people can work remotely, and hey, they get more done because they're not being interrupted every 5 minutes, and they're not attending countless meetings. So I'm really curious to see what comes out of that. But I mean, these are just some of the things that are wrong with the way organizations operate nowadays. But I'm happy to dive in however you like.
Well, I want to ask you a couple questions about it, because as you were talking, I was reminded of a situation I was in a little while back, earlier on in my career, where I had this boss who, I never forget, she called me into her office. I think I had gotten to work at 7 in the morning. I'm an early person. I always have been. I used to get to work super early. And in New York City, that's where I was living at the time, getting to work at 7 a.m. was like getting to work at midnight. Like nobody was up at 7 a.m. It's kind of a late city, instead of an early city.
Yeah. Never sleeps.
And I'll never forget, my boss called me in and she said, I have a problem with your work. And I said, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? And she said, it's not the quality of it. The quality, it's great. It's that you're leaving at 4 p.m. I was like, well, okay, but if my work is good, then I don't understand the problem. Like I was baffled, and she didn't really have anything concrete to follow up on that. She just was making it clear that leaving at 4 was clearly unacceptable, because 9 to 5, right, were the hours, or 9 to 6, or actually the culture of that company was to stay late, which I didn't like. I preferred to get in early. So it's kind of interesting that you say that about like hours versus output. And I'm and the kind of 50 interruptions and the outsourcing of accountability. What do you think? And you kind of started to allude to this with stress and dissatisfaction at work. But what do you think is the impact of all of that we're facing?
Well, the impacts, I mean, just to double click on what you've talked about there, I mean, getting into work at 7 and leaving at 4, I mean, that's effectively 9 hours. Say you take away
still a long day.
For lunch. Still a long day. Take away an hour for lunch, that's 8 hours. And I mean, when we're engaged on work that requires thinking, we can only really get into that space of deep work, or the zone, so to speak, for about 4 hours. And that's providing we create or cultivate an environment where we can do that, where we're free of interruptions for, say, an hour-long stretches. After that point, your rate of output starts going south very, very quickly. We hit that point of diminishing returns, and this is why so many people might be sitting at their desks at like 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon after hitting the office at, say, 8 a.m., and they're just done for the day. But what inevitably happens is you just sit there, you check email, you're present until 5 p.m. and then you head off. And for a lot of people, that's just very unfulfilling. And I think in terms of the impact of all of this is that we effectively don't see the link between our work and the output in a lot of organizations, because the feedback loop, which I do something, I see the results of that doing something, I learn from that, and then we adapt. The feedback loop in a lot of companies is really, really, really long. And that's because to get anything done, we have to attend numerous meetings. We have to get numerous sign-offs. It can take weeks, if not months, to get something as rudimentary as the font and the color scheme on a landing page to test the new product we want to take to market approved. And now, if you're going to work day after day after day after day, you're doing a lot of things, but nothing seems to be moving the needle. That has a very, very negative impact on employee morale. Employee morale suffers, but also long feedback loops has been known to preempt a feeling of a lack of control for people. And a lack of control ties into burnout. And just ultimately dissatisfaction at work. It's only 15% of people globally are actually engaged at work. The other 85% are either not engaged or actively disengaged. And, that's pretty crazy. I mean, we're talking about 1 in 8 people roughly are actually engaged at work. Everyone else is kind of just skating by.
I used to really fight the fact that about 1, 2 o'clock, I start to mentally crash. And I get up at 4 a.m. I go to the gym, and then I start working pretty early, or get my kids ready and then start working. But either way, I'm starting early. So by 1, I'm pretty mentally tapped. And I used to really mistake that, just frankly, I'm out of energy because I've expended a ton, with being lazy, right? Or just like Facebook is sucking me in and I'm being distracted and I'm not being a go-getter and I'm not being productive, and like all the things, right, that you can imagine.
Yeah.
And I flipped that recently. I've really come to realize that my brain needs just a break, right? I'll take the dog for a walk. I'll even nap. Like I will do what I need to do to get my reserves. Like it's like charging my phone, right? Like I just sometimes need to go back. But what really kind of strikes me kind of in what I just shared and really what you're sharing is that I think the second layer or consequence of all this is as a leader, I look at my team and I go, they're so lazy, right? They're not getting their job. They're not being effective. Why aren't they being proactive? How come more is not getting done, right? Like all of that kind of starts to bubble up. But the reality is we're not setting them up for success because we expect this ridiculous 8 hours of focus, which to your point, all the research has shown is not actually possible.
No, it's not. And I think it requires leaders to cultivate an environment where people can actually get stuff done and can derive a sense of fulfillment and accomplishment from their work. I mean, my latest book, Time Rich, was essentially inspired by an article I wrote for Harvard Business Review called The Case for the 6-Hour Workday. And this was based on an experiment that my team run, my company run. So I run Collective Campus, and we've got about 50 odd consultants and facilitators around the world, and we work with large organizations on innovation. But ultimately, I said, we were working on average, say 8:30 a.m. till about 6:30, 7 p.m. That was like a typical work day. That's a really long day, but I asked myself, why are we doing this? Like, I'm no longer employed in the corporate world. I'm no longer bound by other people's rules. And when I was reflecting on how I was performing throughout my day, it was very much, 2 to 3 p.m. I was starting to taper off big time. And I guess I felt that as the quote unquote leader of this organization, I needed to set a quote unquote good example and just work late. But dove into the research on this topic, the more I realized that really wasn't making sense, because the point of diminishing returns, people spend less time on work they enjoy. Well, people spend less time doing things outside of the office, less time for the gym, less time with family and friends. So I decided we'd run an experiment, and that experiment was a 6-hour workday. And in order for the experiment to be successful, though, we needed to, one, ensure that people were working on high value tasks. Two, we needed to automate away all of those rudimentary things that can get in the way, that can add up to a lot of, task switching throughout someone's day. And three, we just outsourced a lot of the things that couldn't be automated, that were, again, taking up valuable employee time. And by doing that, and by creating an environment where you couldn't actually interrupt other people as such, like you could send them a message on Slack and they would get back to you when they were ready, they were able to then just focus and get stuff done. And that does require also that you have good people on the bus who are values aligned with your organization, who are self-motivated and actually want to make a real contribution to the world. So, I mean, there are a lot of things to align when it comes to working shorter work days, particularly in an organizational context. But what we found on the back of that experiment was we found people were as productive, if not more productive, than they were when they were working longer hours. And we also found that people were generally happier because they got to reconnect not only with family and friends, but also those personal interests that perhaps they were neglecting previously, like going out dancing and doing all that sort of stuff in the evening hours, rather than turning up at home at 8 p.m. and being absolutely pooped for the day and just turning on Netflix and being done with it.
How do you think we got trapped into being so busy? And of course, what's coming to mind is that, just to show my age, that Seinfeld episode where George Costanza just throws up, like, always looks busy. If nobody bothers him and they think he's doing a great job, as long as he looks busy, and he figured this out. But why is this? I mean, I get the 8-hour workday, but there's more to it, right? Like, why, particularly in this day and age of technology and virtual and flex time, and, there's a war on talent, right? Companies all over are trying to be better bosses, right? Better companies, better cultures. Why is busy still this marker of success? And it's false, of course, but
it is. And I think, as human beings, we want to derive a sense of self-worth from things. And growing up, that could be that, you're really good at breakdancing, or it could be playing the guitar or playing basketball in your high school basketball team, or whatever the case is. But as we get older, for many people, we grow up, so to speak, which I think is absolutely the wrong term. And we have less and less of these things in our lives. And oftentimes the only thing we do have in our lives to derive a sense of self-worth or contribution to the world, for a lot of people, it is work. Work is something whereby it is a socially validated way to spend your time. And it's much easier to do something like sit at your desk for an extra 3 hours in the evening because, hey, I'm working hard. I'm providing for my family. I'm climbing the corporate ladder because that's easier than I'm going to leave work at a normal hour today and I'm going to go and, I don't know, sign up to a martial arts gym or sign up to something new that's going to take me out of my comfort zone and get me to do things that I've never done before and meet people who I've never met before and start conversations from scratch with people I've never met before. And that can be really difficult for a lot of people versus sitting at your desk, looking at that spreadsheet or that PowerPoint proposal or whatever it is, doing something that's familiar and that is, again, socially validated. That's just the easy thing to do. And our brains are wired to conserve energy. I mean, that's an evolutionary trait, So if our brain is going to conserve energy, it's going to stick to the things that it finds familiar because it doesn't need to think as much. But if you go out and do something you've never done before, like if you've never surfed before and you go out to Huntington Beach on the US's West Coast and you go out there for a surf, your mental energy, your synapses are going to be absolutely firing because it's like, this is completely new. It's so novel and your brain just gets so tired doing that sort of stuff. But again, it's going to say, I don't want to do that. I just want to like sit at my desk and review this spreadsheet because I've done that 1,000 times before. I know it. I'm good at it. I'm easy. It's validated. Let's just do more of that.
It's interesting. So this weekend I took a welding class. I've always wanted to take one.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm building this little statue. And to your point, like, this is a whole new experience. I have no idea how to weld. I haven't done anything since woodwork in 8th grade in the 80s. So it was like completely out of my norm. But one of the things I've committed to recently, to your point, is taking more and more classes, things outside, things I'm passionate about, and also things that I'm just curious about and want to learn. And I was telling somebody that I took this class, and then I had this burst of just getting into the flow, right? So it was like right after the class, I was driving to the grocery store and I was like, oh my God, I need to pull over and I've solved these like 3 things. And to your point, my brain was rewiring and creating new connections and new synapses were firing. And I think we forget that there's actually this incredible link between all this stuff that happens in our personal life and the work that we do, and actually one feeds the other, right? So I think that we make this mistake of trying to keep them separate. So at work, we look busy, and then we go home and we do stuff. Then we leave that stuff at home, and we go to work and we look busy. And neither serves the other.
Yeah, and there's definitely a direct link between spending more time in flow and emotional well-being, and then you do transfer that emotional well-being back into your personal life, whether it is how you show up with your family, with your friends, with society in general.
Yeah.
And I've found that many a time. Some days when I've found myself doing lots of little rudimentary things and a lot of tasks switching. The cognitive decline is very, very rapid, but at the end of the day, I just feel crap. But then there's been other days where I have, say, gotten into flow and maybe I've worked on an article that's 2,000 words long and I was like so immersed in my work for say 3 or 4 hours writing that article that the feeling I had afterwards for several hours on end was one where I felt like I'd taken some sort of illicit substance. I was just absolutely buzzing and I was super friendly to people and just really jovial. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't really give enough consideration to insofar as the link between flow, deep work, getting in the zone, and being our very best people. And to your point, taking classes, I mean, last year I decided to just hit the local open mic stand-up comedy circuit. I set myself a target of doing five 5-minute shows. I did a bunch of research on how to put together something that was even somewhat remotely going to get a laugh, even though more often than not they did not. But going out and doing that, it was. I tell people doing open mic stand-up nights is the best and the worst thing you can do at the same time. But I think cultivating time to do those things, putting them in your calendar, is really, really important. Otherwise, you can find yourself staring down the barrel of 60 or 70 and looking back in your life and saying, all I did was sit at my desk and go on the occasional holiday to a resort somewhere, and that was it. So yeah, you really need to be intentional about these things.
That's right. And much more right than your 2-week vacation. I want to ask you a question about a testimonial I saw about your book. And just for all of us out there, time rich, do your best work, live your best life. So let me scroll down here to the testimonial. It's just the way she said it that I loved and I wanted to ask you about. She said, reclaim the value of your time by forsaking the management of it and learning instead to manage energy efficiency and attention. So this is what she's saying she got out of your book. So being able to reclaim time, right? And this energy. Yeah. Give us your top tips for that. Like if I open this book, what are some things it's going to tell me? How can I do that? Because I have to imagine, like me sitting here at my desk listening to you, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm exhausted, but I'm not exhausted because I'm in the flow and I'm out and I'm energized and I'm alive and I'm really contributing my best work. I'm exhausted because of all the other things you said. That I'm kind of skating by. That long feedback loop is killing me. I'm not doing my best work. I'm super busy, but I'm not getting anywhere. So tell me about that. How do you reclaim?
There's numerous things you can do. The first thing would be that, there's two ways people really waste their time. One is on jumping to conclusions and making poor decisions. And therefore what that means is the actions you take the wrong actions. So Peter Drucker once said, there's nothing worse than the wrong things done right. So you can spend your time doing stuff that's just not going to move the needle. On the flip side of that is analysis paralysis, where we pontificate for weeks and months on ends about doing something and don't ever do anything because we're scared of making the wrong decision. So how do you get around that? Well, you can run short experiments to generate data and make data-informed decisions around your decisions. If it is something that's quite consequential, you can speak to people who perhaps have some sort of merit in this space, can give you some insights, but at the same time, you want to make a decision, go for it, make sure you're measuring the outcome of your work and adapting as you go. That way you can make sure that you're not wasting your time. So with everything, you want to try and have measurable data that you can check in on a frequent enough basis, but not too often, so that you can adapt, change course, make sure you're spending your time on high value things. But I came up with an acronym that might be helpful for people, and it's called P-coats. So based on the winter jacket, the P-coat. And what that stands for essentially is P for prioritize. So a lot of people don't effectively prioritize their work. They'll look at their to-do list, and what they'll do is the easiest thing first. They'll jump on LinkedIn, they'll check email, and before you know it, 2 hours have gone by and it's time for their mid-morning coffee.
Add TikTok in there now too, by the way.
Oh yeah, TikTok in there as well. But one thing I like to do in that space is once you've prioritized based on the things that are the highest impact, the highest ROI. I mean, just to take an example from nature, nature is our greatest teacher. And when you observe, say, a lion in the wild, they're not out hunting tigers and cheetahs and leopards, because that's going to be a very, difficult proposition. And perhaps they're not going to offer as much of a meal as, say, a zebra. So a zebra is going to be easier to catch, higher impact, and it's basically about the ROI. So when you're looking at, say, your to-do list, you've got 10 items on the to-do list. You're going to go for what is the highest ROI activity? Let's do that. So doing those activities first, because what Isaac Newton taught us was that an object in motion stays in motion. That was essentially one of the key learnings from his laws of motion theory. So once you do the hardest thing first, it builds momentum, and you'll find that rather than spend the first 2 hours of your day looking at email, by mid-morning, you would have done your best work for the day. And anything you do beyond that is actually a bonus. So prioritize is absolutely key. The second thing, cut. Once every quarter with my team and as an individual, I like to draw up a quadrant. In that quadrant, I will write start, stop, more, less. How am I spending my time? What are my tasks? What are the products I'm trying to sell? Who are the customer segments I'm going after? And just being really objective about what's working, what's not, what should we do more of and what should we do less of, and then adapting based on that. Because there's going to be lots of stuff that you're doing perhaps on a daily basis because you've always done it, that just isn't moving the needle. Maybe you're doing it because it's easy. Maybe it's something that you can hide behind. I like to call that insecurity work. But really being objective with yourself and saying, this isn't moving the needle. Let's cut that out of my day. And suddenly you've saved yourself maybe 4 or 5 hours a week. The next word in Peacoats is outsource. Nowadays, like I've got so many things. I've got about 30 hours a week of stuff that I used to do that I now outsource to virtual assistants for about $8 an hour on average. And in their economy, that's quite a lot of money. It empowers them to live a good life. So everybody wins, but it also means that I can free myself up to focus on higher value work. In Peacoats is automate. What can you automate? Nowadays, there's tools coming out every other week that can help you automate things. We created a tool using a couple of off-the-shelf platforms, one being Airtable, the other being a tool called WebMerge, which will effectively generate client proposals for us. So we'll just plug in we'll select the slides we need, we'll add the client name and logo, it will generate the proposal in something like 5 minutes, and then we might spend 10 or 15 minutes customizing that proposal and off it goes, rather than spending an hour or two trying to build something from scratch, rather than checking with the rest of the team and saying, hey, you wrote a proposal on this 3 months ago, can you find that and send it to me, and waiting for them. It just means you can just get stuff done much faster. T was test, which was something I alluded to earlier around experimenting and using data to inform your decisions. And finally, S is start your engines. What are those things you can do to help you get more done in less time? So I talked about doing the hardest thing first, but there are other things like cultivating an interruption-free environment, putting your phone in another room when you're trying to get into flow, blocking out chunks of time in your calendar so that people aren't booking meetings throughout your entire day so that you can never focus on something for more than 5 minutes. And simple things like incorporating movement into your day. Rather than sitting at your desk ad infinitum, get up every hour or so and walk around for 5 to 10 minutes, because it's been shown that movement does light up certain parts of the brain that are associated with thinking and focus. So it's really important to realize that sometimes by taking a rest, that has a paradoxical effect on being more productive rather than being less productive.
It's funny. So I do push-ups. That's my thing. I'll do 10 to 15 push-ups in between, like when I transition from one task to the next. But to your thing about start your engines, that little thing helps me mentally close out one task and energize for the next. It's been fascinating. That's not why I did it. I did it because I needed to get more push-ups in. And then the side effect of it has been like, oh, this is actually really working. And you don't get sweaty doing 10 push-ups, so you can have your work clothes on. I want to.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, really. It's like 10 push-ups, like in and out, done, right? It takes me 15 seconds. I want to go back to your first, the P about prioritize, because to me, that one sets up everything else and is so essential. And I don't know if you read the book, The One Thing, but right. So it's a great book. I've referenced it a few times, but the thing that really works for me is that first thing I do in the morning, or the first thing I schedule out every day, is that one thing that makes everything else, I can't remember his exact language, but easier or irrelevant, right? Do the one thing that. So to your point about prioritizing, it's so funny how we think, oh, I'll get some small wins. I'll answer 3 emails and I'll respond to my LinkedIn messages and I'll check Facebook. So but none of it really moved the needle, right? Unless somebody absolutely needs a response from me. Like sometimes my first thing is, if I get that freelancer the information they need now, they have all day to do it. So I have to do that first. But do you find, actually, let me ask you this. How do you decide what that first thing is? So I can imagine that those of us with a little bit of practice have now figured it out. But if you are that person who has the list, the checklist of things you have to get through, and you either just start at the top or work your way down, or just start with the easiest. How do you get out of that mindset and into the framework of, I'm going to decide what's most important and do that first?
Yeah, so I use a simple calculation, if you will, to determine what is the most important work to get done first. So that calculation just looks like impact divided by cost. So I'll just write down my tasks in a column, and then next to that, I'll have 2 more columns for impact and cost, which I'll objectively try and rate out of 10. So what's the impact of this task on moving the needle on my business, right? So it might be a 9. And the cost is essentially not just the financial cost, but the time investment that this particular task will require. So that could be, I don't know, I've made it difficult for myself. Actually, that could be a 3. So 9 for impact, cost 3. the score is 3. But then there might be something else on that list, which is, say, a 6 for impact and a 5 for cost. So we're looking at maybe like a 1.2 or so. So 3 divided by 3 versus 1.2. Clearly, I'm going to do that task that I scored 3. Now, there is a nuance to this. Certain times, a particular task might be higher in terms of urgency. So you just want to be conscious of that. So sometimes I will throw in a weighting for urgency, but that's complicating things. I mean, if you just want something simple to start with, value out of 10 divided by cost out of 10, and then just do that first thing. Everything else, you're basically seeing. You want to see the tree from the forest in a way, rather than getting bogged down in the entire forest and feeling overwhelmed by everything on your to-do list, and do that first thing first. Because to your point about that the book you mentioned, with regards to doing the one thing, in again with respect to nature, the 80-20 principle, it shows up in your work as well. It's funny, when I posted when I shared my 6-hour workday article on LinkedIn, someone commented saying, that sounds great in theory, but I could never get all of my tasks done in 6 hours. Which I suppose there is a supposition in that comment that all of your tasks are created equal. But the Pareto principle, yeah, I mean, the Pareto principle suggests that 20% of your inputs will create 80% of your outputs. And if you break that down, like if you take 20 times 20%, 80 times 80%, what you find is that 4% of your inputs create 64% of your outputs. So it really is about finding the signal in the noise. Like, what is that one thing, as you said, that's going to create most of the value in your work? It might be the thing that's the most difficult to do, but it is the thing that's going to move the needle a lot more forward. So I know currently in my business right now, the one thing I need to do is put together this proposal. Fortunately, we've got a tool that can generate that for us and send that off to a client who's keen to do quite a big piece of work with us. But I've promised that to them in the next 24 hours. Now, there's that. And then the next thing on my list is making a bunch of cold calls for a new product we've launched, for the purpose of actually learning as quickly as we can from a particular customer segment whether or not this product pricing and so on is actually to their liking. Because I could hide behind my email and send a bunch of emails, LinkedIn messages for this product, but I know that in this case, getting on the phone, talking to people is going to be the fastest, best way I can learn, even though it's probably the thing I least want to do, because let's face it, cold calling people who've never heard from you absolutely sucks. Again, it comes back to our evolutionary biases, and we don't want to be ostracized from the tribe or humiliated or whatnot. But I know that in terms of impact over cost, it's definitely the next thing I need to be working on.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent, but it relates very deeply to all of this. So one of the things that we've discovered in our research over here around innovation and in specific human-centered innovation, so how we innovate as humans and the impact of it, and this will be no surprise to you, but just as a springboard for conversation, is that innovation, being innovative, so our ability to strategically solve something, think differently, creatively solve something, all of that actually is not only essential and possible for all of us, it's hardwired actually into our brain. Some of us just use it more, but also it, more importantly, I think to this conversation, it actually taps our reward center and releases dopamine. So the feel good, right, chemical when we do it. So not only does it help us solve our problems in a more meaningful, sticky way, but also, right, it makes us feel good. Like we want to give ourselves a little virtual high five when we do that. So I'm curious, when you think about the being time rich and setting yourself up for that, how does that then help you get into that state of innovation more often, so that you can also not just get to happiness because you've got 2 hours every day back, but also tap that side of yourself more often?
Yeah, well, I guess if you cultivate an environment where you are time rich, what it means is you're spending less time on shallow level work, you're spending less time in meetings that perhaps you shouldn't be spending time in, you're spending less time in email and LinkedIn, which does create the time and space to actually innovate. It creates mental space for you to, one, come up with, identify problems, to identify new ideas, because it's usually when you've given your brain space that you ideate, not just in brainstorming sessions and workshops. And the more time you have, the more you can then run experiments and learn from those experiments. And I know when I am testing a market appetite for a new idea or trying to find product market fit, like the most rewarding aspect of that hero's journey, so to speak, is the learnings you get along the way. Like you said, like even yesterday, I met with, so this is around an edtech product that we've developed, and I met with someone who was in the edtech space but not competitive, and I was able to decipher things that would have taken me weeks or months to learn if I tried to just do these through sheer persistence. And I was able to immediately run some experiments on the back of that information, and I got a bump in the data that suggested I'm on the right track. And I was just buzzing after that. And that, to me, is how you go about creating more value rather than just moving around documents effectively and sitting in meetings and hiding behind that insecurity work.
I love that you call it insecurity work, by the way. That's such a great way to say it. I mean, it's unfortunate in some ways, but really accurate. I just was writing down what you just said because I think it's a really important point for all of us on Launch Street to pay attention to, and just the way you framed it, I love. It translates into what I'm hearing a lot around, like, oh my God, software is taking my job. AI is taking over my job. But the truth is, if you're a document pusher, you should be worried because you're right. Yeah. Technology can do that. But if you're truly adding value and playing in that higher, more innovative space where you are reclaiming your own time and your energy, then you have a lot less to worry about because, to your point, your value is not just there. It actually becomes demanded. And you're not playing in that insecurity work. I love that.
Yeah, 100%. And Price's law suggests that with organizations, it's the square root of the organization's headcount that creates most of the value. So if you're 100 people, people create half of the value. And so you do have a lot of people who are hiding behind, the insecurity work, pushing paper around. And it echoes a conversation I had with Alec Ross. And Alec was Barack Obama's advisor on technology and innovation during his campaign back in, 2008. And one thing he alludes to in his book, The Industries of the Future, is that in the future, which I think we're there now, there will be no room for mediocrity. And I think this is such a key thing. And it's something that I think perhaps hasn't filtered its way down. It definitely hasn't into the education system, where we're still preparing students for compliance as opposed to preparing them to challenge the status quo, to be more adaptable to changing circumstances, to identify new opportunities and learn how to experiment and pursue those opportunities and know when to stop and do something else. And I think these are such critical things that we're just not preparing today's children for. But I'm kind of digressing for a moment there, but just as you mentioned that, it just came to mind. And I think it's probably a good thing. I mean, the growing automation sort of movement, if you will. I mean, we're looking at 40 to 60% of today's jobs not existing in 10 to 15 years or being completely automated. And that just means that, people will have to adapt to that. And if they don't, well, who knows what will happen? I mean, Alexis Ohanian from Reddit basically thinks that the humans will rise up before the machines. So who knows? And as we were alluding to before, we went live, Tamara, we were talking about the toilet paper.
The shortage of it all of a sudden at every grocery store.
Exactly. So, and we've seen how some people have reacted and perhaps not put their best feet forward. So, and that's just toilet paper. So machines do take all of the jobs, and I'm pretty fearful for our future.
Well, I just want to loop back to it before we kind of close out, because this is, to me, it's a really fascinating conversation in a lot of ways, not just about the hours we work, but the skills that we need to be valuable in today's world, right? Which is really is truly transformed. It's not even going to happen. To your point, it has happened. And that really is the ability to innovate and adapt and solve complex problems and be a strategic thinker and critical thinker. And we're not teaching our kids that. And also, I'd say for those of us adults in the workforce, whether we're entrepreneurs or work at a medium, small, big, whatever company, we're also not working within systems that reward that. So, and I'll give you just a small example that I thought was interesting that happened to me recently. I was in this meeting, and there were 5 of us, and we were planning this event, and everybody was on board to do it this one way. And then I spoke up because we were talking about it, I'm like, you know what, there's something about this that's not working for me. And so I said it very nicely. Of course, I wasn't like, you guys, this is horrible. I just said, hey, I want us to consider a different way to look at this event. I think we might be better served if we do it this way for these reasons. And it was a total flip on how we were structuring the event, not the objectives we were trying to achieve, not the people involved, not kind of the energy and the marketing we were going to create, but just the structure. And I will tell you, Steve, the amount of resistance out of the gate that I got was shocking because you could see everybody's wheels come to a screeching halt. And these are smart people. This is not about them lacking intelligence at all. But that moment of critical thinking took a second. Like their wheels were going in one direction. It needed to stop, and then the wheels needed to go in the other direction. But that change of force takes time and takes effort, and we're not rewarding people for doing that.
So I think that story speaks to what we kind of touched on earlier with our brain's natural tendency to want to conserve energy. I mean, whenever there is some kind of massive change, it means we need to completely rewire our worldview. We need to change our approach to things, and this is going to require us to do a lot more work than we previously thought. So naturally, people have an aversion to change, and it is a matter of being cognizant of that and not expecting things to change overnight as such, and learning from the laws of motion I mentioned earlier, like just starting small and going from there. It's like if you're going to try and roll out, say, agile or some new methodology in an organization, it's rather than trying to roll it out at once across 1,000 people, perhaps roll it out across a team of 5 who are working on a very specific project, have them get some quick wins on the board, and then have other people naturally want to learn how they did that and go from snowflake to avalanche, if you will, rather than trying to just force the avalanche onto people from day one, because then you will inevitably be faced with a hell of a lot of resistance, and it's just going to make your job a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I like how you said that, going from a snowflake to an avalanche. I think sometimes we undervalue the small steps it takes to make change. And I just think, as someone who leads a team, if my team member speaks up and says, hey, I'm not sure I agree with this, or hey, I think we should do this differently, or here's another perspective, even if we don't go in their direction, I want to hear it out, because to your point about the complex thinking, that or solving complex problems, that's what that takes, is that willingness to allow that, like, let me pause and think about this for a second. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think about your time-rich approach, part of what I heard in that, what the brilliance of it really is, it gives me the space to actually think a little bit deeply, because I'm not shuffling papers and just, what was it that, is it Austin Powers? There's that scene where he's like, move that from here to there, now from there back to here, right? And that's all the person in the scene does. But I hear a sense of like mental space in it too, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, and I think to your point about disagreeing with other people, I think that is a part of being time rich. I mentioned not jumping to conclusions. Like if we're too scared to speak up and it's just the highest paid person's opinion that wins the day, that more often than not, it's probably not the right opinion. Like we need to challenge each other and be comfortable challenging each other, and then through that process of friction, deciding on the best possible outcome, or the best possible outcome based on the information at our disposal, and then working on that. And then just by virtue of making the better decision, we spend our time on higher value things.
Right.
And, that character attribute though, of being comfortable speaking up and going against the grain, I mean, one, having a culture where, people are comfortable doing that.
Yeah, it's actually allowed.
Yeah, it's actually allowed and not frowned upon, and doesn't result in you being officially or unofficially reprimanded in some way. But also cultivating those character attributes earlier in life by doing things where you do face conflict, whether it's martial arts or something to that effect, and getting comfortable. Yeah, and getting comfortable with that adversity, like we were talking about earlier, trying new things, doing new classes, so that you have a disposition towards adversity that doesn't leave you say disabled in those meetings whereby you feel like you just don't want to push back because you can't deal with people looking down upon your decision, or you just can't deal with that discomfort.
You just gave me a new way to think about Mike Tyson's famous quote. Oh, it's one of my favorite quotes, which is, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah.
Which I love that quote so much. But I used to love it because it said to me like, hey, a plan is only worth so much. You got to get out there and do. But I never really thought about what you're saying, which is like you get used to being punched in the face and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Not that's okay physically, but you know what I mean, metaphorically and in work, is you are ready to take disagreement. I think upon reflection, one of the best gifts a boss of mine, Mike Hall was his name. He was amazing. I was launching a department in a marketing company in New York for him. He was in Chicago at our parent company. And when we first were starting, I had to go to Chicago every week and present to him our pitch deck. Like we were going to go to a client as we were prepping, and he would rip me apart every single time. And quite, I don't want to say meanly, but aggressively. But he was doing it to make it better. And the first time I don't cry, but if I did cry, that would have been the moment. And then the second time I toughened up. And by the third time, I looked forward to it. But he really taught me that lesson of being willing to embrace conflict and that it's not a bad thing. And I think that that's a really powerful lesson. I can't believe we're getting close out of time. So before I ask you the last couple questions, where can people go to get the book, learn more, connect with you?
So people can head over to timerichbook.com. And I've also made some free resources available there, such as a Time Rich Tools downloadable PDF, which has a whole bunch of tools that can help them to literally start saving time today.
Excellent.
And they can download the first chapter for free as well.
Awesome. So here's my last question for you. If I'm listening to this and I'm like, yeah, I'm bought in, aside from buying the book, obviously, which I think we should all go do, what is the first thing I can do to help get my time back? And I want to focus this question in if I'm working in an environment that's maybe fighting me on that a little bit.
Sure. So the first thing you can do, so I take your question to mean I'm working for a large organization or an organization where the culture is not really.
Yeah, it's maybe not as enlightened as this conversation is.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would do is delineate between what you can control and what you can't control. So you may not be able to change the meeting culture that the organization has, and the fact that people can just go off and book time in other people's meetings, and that's not given a second thought. Firstly, I don't think you should be able to just steal time in people's calendars. I think you should be able to you need to sell a meeting to someone because you're effectively taking their time, and time is one thing once we spend it that we can't get back. So once you know what you can control and what you can't control, focus on the things that you can control. And that might just be that, when you're getting into work, focus on the hardest thing. I mean, that is something that you can control. When it's mid-morning and you've got another task on your to-do list that is quite important, but your brain is kind of telling you, hey, let's just check email. Just be cognizant of that fact and don't. And then there's other things that you can do that you control. Like whenever I go into a large company, oftentimes I'll just walk the floor and observe what people are doing on their screens. And I'm just seeing notifications pop up left, right, and center on their phones, on their desktops. Like turning those off when you're trying to actually get work done goes a very long way. And you can use tools like BlockSite, for example, to limit access to certain applications during certain times of day. I use a Gmail plugin called Inbox Pause, which means I don't get emails coming in during certain times of day. So I'm not
you just rocked my world with that.
Yeah, it is fantastic. And I'm not chasing rabbits down rabbit holes whenever I go into my email. I don't see new emails, but if I need to send something, I can do that. So yeah, being diligent about what I can control and then just doing better with those things.
That is great advice. And by the way, I just want to echo what you said about you shouldn't give away your time. And that you should have to sell a meeting. I think this is why we also get into the mindset or what I see as the practice of, it's not even a mindset, of a lot of my clients who have 3 meetings booked at once. Like it's crazy town. And then it's like they have to decide which meeting they're going to go to in that time, but they're never really present in anything. It's horrible to me. It really it's disrespectful to people. I think it devalues people's time, to your point. And I've learned that lesson the hard way, where there was a time when I would wake up and be like, who put what on my calendar today? And you cannot get work done. And I had to go in and start blocking stuff off. Even it didn't matter. Like I would just block mornings off every week because it was the only way to get people out of my calendar. I mean, it was insane. And you know what I learned too? Because people would say, oh, tomorrow I don't want to offend anyone. Like I don't want my boss to get mad. You can train people. People will get trained to do it the right way. So I love that advice. I think that is a great way to end. So Steve, thank you so much for coming on. I feel like there's more. Like we haven't even gotten to the back part of the book, but that's okay. Another time.
That's okay. I really enjoyed the conversation, Tamara. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for hanging with us on Inside Launch Street. If you know someone that is truly ready to unlock their innovation advantage, have them join you on Launch Street. Discover your innovation advantage. Build a team of high-performing innovators and ignite ideas and solutions that create massive impact. GOTO, launchstreet.com. Remember, innovators, if you don't take the leap, somebody else will.